Hi, so I'm Kurt, and I'm going to be showing you some different types of motion. So we're going to start with shoulder abductions and shoulder adductions. So the abduction would be when you started right here, and you moved your arm up into here. That would be a lateral abduction, and then adduction would be when you pull it down, you have some sort of opposing force. So this is an adduction, and this is an abduction. Again, that's of the shoulder joint. And these happen on the coronal planes, these abductions, and they occur along the sagittal axis. So an example of an exercise for that would be, so one of my favorite shoulder abduction exercises is simply a lateral raise. Just like that. Lift your arm out to the side. And that is a good shoulder abduction exercise. Now, I don't have it here, but a good shoulder adduction exercise is when you have either a resistance band or a rope attached to some sort of pulley, and you pull against the resistance of the rope and you pull it down to your side here, and then you slowly let it up, and then you pull it down, and that would be an example of an adduction exercise that you could do. So the next one that we're going to talk about here is the flexion of your lumbar, specifically laterally. So a lateral lumbar flexion would just be like this. So you're flexing the lateral portion of your lumbar. So you go down, just like this, or like that. And that occurs along the coronal plane and occurs along the sagittal axis. So one very common lateral flexion of the lumbar exercise is simply putting the opposing arm above your head, slowly, in controlled motion. Begin to tilt to one side. And that is a pretty common stretch or low impact exercise, which involves the flexation of the lateral lumbar. So the next one that we're going to talk about is the shoulder girdle protraction and retraction. So this is a protraction of the shoulder girdle. It goes forward, and then a retraction. Like that. And these movements occur along the sagittal plane and the coronal axis. Yes. So a common use of shoulder protraction is actually just a punch. So that's a protraction of the shoulder girdle, just like that. A common retraction of the shoulder girdle would be some sort of row. Specifically starting out like this with a weight. You pull it in and retract until it's back. And those muscles are engaged. I'll just give you a side view. This would be the shoulder girdle retraction as it goes back. So, yeah. Okay, so the next movements that we'll be talking about is the knee flexion and extension. So the knee flexion is like this. You bring it up. That would be a knee flexion. Whereas an extension would be an extending like that. So flexion, extension. And both of those occur along the sagittal plane and the coronal axis. So a very common activity that involves actually both knee flexion and extension in tangent is you have a knee flexion to wind up for a kick, and then an extension, and the ball goes flying. Most commonly in such games as soccer, football, or what have you. But yeah, that's just a very common usage of that particular movement. So the last one that we'll be talking about is both the medial and lateral rotation of the hip. And so medial rotation is like this. So that would be a medial rotation, or rotation inwards towards the center line. And then a lateral rotation is outwards. So you would rotate it like that. That would be a lateral rotation of the hip. And this takes place on the transverse plane and the vertical axis. Yes. And then some common exercises, or, well, activities, sports that go along with that is, especially hacky sack, which I'm no good at, or else I would do a better demonstration. But that would be catching a ball like this, and then maybe throwing it up and rotating it laterally to catch it over there. Or in soccer, juggling, it's pretty common to flip it up over top and catch it in the back. Back there again. And it's hard to do that, very hard. As you see, I was losing my balance just attempting those. Yeah, but those are examples of the lateral and medial rotation of the hip. So, as we explore the topic of tensegrity, I would just first like to show my tensegrity model here. Shows all the different axes, and yeah. So this model is actually very interesting to me. I'm not usually one for creating something, but when it's for a purpose such as this, it's actually really, really helpful to get a visual, because it's difficult. Well, there are pictures to see inside of the human skeleton and whatnot, but when you're creating this yourself and you don't get to see the end product until, of course, you have finished it, it's just a very eye-opening experience. So the thing I found interesting was how essentially the sticks in this are your bones, and the elastics are essentially your different connective tissues, or your muscles. So something interesting is that your skeleton never really touches your skeleton. So your bones aren't connected. They're not stacked on top of each other. They're not compressed. Your bones are held together by elastic forces. So like this. This is how your body is essentially held together, which is crazy when you think of it, because coming into this course, I had absolutely no idea that it was your body kind of in a constant state of certain things pulling on other things, which lead to a tensile force, which is just holding it in place. It's not just stacked on top of each other, because if that was the case, there would be tons of pressure, tons of downward pressure. So the lower down you would go on your body, the more pressure there would be, which would just be incredibly bad for your body. But this way, it's not so much a stacked force as it is constantly being pulled into different directions, which I thought was incredibly interesting. Essentially our bones are just floating, actually, just being held there. And so I thought this was a very good demonstration of that, of how the intrinsic forces of our body are constantly resisting the extrinsic forces of gravity. And that's how our posture is maintained. That's why I can sit here like this and I don't fall down, I don't get crushed. My body is constantly holding itself together with elastic or tensile force. And we can have motion in this, and our tensile force still holds. So if we were just stacked, then putting my arm out like this, well, there would be nothing to support it, because that's a stack. But as it is, it's connected. My arm is connected to the very center of my body by these tensile forces. So we can have movement, we can have extension, we can have flexion, we can have all these different things, because there's constant tension holding our muscles together still, despite whatever weird or awkward movements that we make. Even in this, you can push it and it's constantly resisting the force that I put on it. It's not just instantly caving or breaking. It's very flexible. You're able to move it and bend it, and it's not something that is just not meant to move, because it's got a lot of leeway here, and just like our bodies. Yeah, so I thought this was an excellent